Good evening, and welcome to the Hollywood Babylonians. Hello, friends! This is your happy Hollywood history host, Mr. Ben Burke, here to tell you what the Hollywood Babylonians is all about. Stay tuned for a brief introduction and explanation of what is to become your favorite Hollywood history and classic film podcast. So the title of our podcast is The Hollywood Babylonians, and I feel like we first need to go through and explain this title because not many people will know what this means. So first, we have to go back to 1935 Hollywood, and there was a little boy named Kenneth Anger who was very angry at Warner Brothers because he had been signed to a contract with Warner Brothers, and he appeared in the 1935 Shakespeare adaptation, Midsummer's Night Dream, which had like James Cagney, Olivia de Havilland, Mickey Rooney, and then I don't think his option was picked up, so he didn't appear in any films after that. But he continued making films in Hollywood, and he was like an underground experimental filmmaker, and he was not associated with like any mainstream Hollywood studio at that point. So he made films throughout the 40s and throughout the 50s, and while he was growing up, he lived with his grandmother, his grandmother's friend. His grandmother's friend had worked on the set of many silent films and been around a lot of different silent film stars in the inner circles of Hollywood elite during silent Hollywood. So she knew different scandals and different stories of these old Hollywood film stars during the silent days. And not all of them were exactly true. Some of them were like speculative. They were just kind of all over the place. Then during the 40s and 50s, Kenneth Anger, when he was making films, underground films in Hollywood, he still were like within these inner circles of the Hollywood elite. There were different mainstream Hollywood stars that were fans of Kenneth Anger. And so we get to 1959 and he's living in Paris and he's practically dead broke. So what he starts doing is he starts writing down all of these stories about Hollywood history and the different scandals that accompanied some of the biggest stars from the talkies up through like the 1950s. He started writing all of these down for a Paris film magazine. And he started making a little bit of money off of it. And he started making enough money to be like, oh, I can write a book and make a lot of money off of this. So then he writes a book called Hollywood Babylon, which I recommend to anybody who loves like old scandals, Hollywood history. And not all of these stories are true in Hollywood Babylon, but the book was published, I think, around 1965 in Europe, and around that same time it was published in America for a very short time. The studio system was still barely chugging along, which what the book pretty much attacked was the studio system and all of the scandals that it created. So the book was banned in America in 1965, and then it came back in the late 70s. I think 77, after the collapse of the studio system when they all went bankrupt in 1969. So then it became like a very popular coffee table book. And Kenneth Anger became like known as this expert on Hollywood history and past scandals. And so a lot of these tales were accepted to be true, which are not. If you want to like a brief rundown, Karina Longworth with You Must Remember This podcast does an incredible podcast over Hollywood Babylon, and the true, well, like fact-checking Hollywood Babylon is pretty much what the whole thing is about. Since we've now learned about Kenneth Anger, we have to go even back farther to 1915 when there was a filmmaker called D.W. Griffith who made a film, very, very racist film, called Birth of the Nation. But it was like the first epic Hollywood film that showed the nation that this business could be lucrative, unfortunately. And it caused the KKK to rise again because it praised what the KKK did. So there was like a second rising of the KKK. That is a different discussion for a different day. Terribly racist film, but it made such a big impact. And unfortunately in 1915, it made so much money that D.W. Griffith was able to go and make an even bigger film the following year called Intolerance, which is not about racial intolerance because he knew nothing of that. But in 1916, he made a film called Intolerance. It's kind of an avant-garde amalgamation of a bunch of different stories from a bunch of different time periods throughout the world. And one of them took place in Babylon. One of the storylines took place in Babylon. So D.W. Griffith had his production designer and the construction crew build this massive Babylon set, which, after Intolerance was released, it made an okay amount of money, but overall it flopped because he spent so much money on it. And so Intolerance flopped, and so that Babylon set was built out on Sunset Boulevard. It was left out on Sunset Boulevard, I think, until like from 1916, 1915, 1916 to 22 or 23, so however 7 or 8 years. And in that time, California deemed it a fire hazard. It started to slowly crumble. And at one time, it had been this great, big, glorious, beautiful set. So Kenneth Anger used the metaphor of like Hollywood looking beautiful and shiny on the outside, but really, in reality, it's kind of crumbling to the ground. He compared that to D.W. Griffith's Babylon set. Even though there were no elephants in Babylon, D.W. Griffith wanted his production designer to design and build these mammoth white elephants on the Babylon set. So this is what Kenneth Anger wrote about it. White elephants. The god of Hollywood wanted white elephants, and white elephants he got, 8 of them. Plaster mammoths perched on mega mushroom pedestals, lording it over the colossal court of Belshazzar. The pasteboard Babylon built beside the dusty Tin Lizzie trail called Sunset Boulevard. A mare's nest mountain of scaffolding, hanging gardens, chariot race, ramparts, and sky-high elephants, a make-believe mirage of Mesopotamia dropped down on the sleepy huddle of missionary-style bungalows amid the orange groves that made up 1950 Hollywood, portent of things to come. The purple epoch had begun, and there it stood for years, stranded like some gargantuan dream beside Sunset Boulevard. Long after Griffith's great leap into the unknown, his sun play of the ages, Intolerance, had failed. Long after Belshazzar's court had sprouted weeds and its walls had begun to peel and warp in abandoned movie set disarray, after the Los Angeles Fire Department had condemned it as a fire hazard, still it stood. Griffith's Babylon, something of a reproach and something of a challenge to the burgeoning movie town, something to surpass, something to live it down. So anyway, he, of course, like I said, he compares the crumbling Babylon set to the crumbling spectacle of Hollywood. Much like Kenneth Anger's book, Hollywood Babylon, which investigates the different Hollywood history and scandals behind some of the great Hollywood stars in the classic films, we too will be investigating many of these classic Hollywood films and these different stars. And so we are known as the Hollywood Babylonians. You have been listening to the Hollywood Babylonians. The Hollywood Babylonians is produced, edited, and written by Ben Burke, and artwork by Ben Burke and Jamie Lee. If you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe, and be sure to follow us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube at The Hollywood Babylonians for more Hollywood Babylonians content. Tune in next week as we explore another classic film out of the golden age of Hollywood and the history behind it. Thank you for listening, and have a good night.